Alright guys, so I briefly mentioned this in some of my previous videos, but we're now getting more information directly from the United Nations on what is probably one of the most disturbing stories that I've covered since October 7th on Israel and Gaza, where mass graves have been uncovered outside of hospitals, okay? Let me just say that again. Mass graves have been uncovered outside of hospitals. Okay, so here is one of the releases from the United Nations directly. They say, disturbing reports continue to emerge about mass graves in Gaza in which Palestinian victims were reportedly found stripped naked with their hands tied, prompting renewed concerns about possible war crimes amid ongoing Israeli airstrikes, and this is according to the UN Human Rights Office, the OHCHR, on Tuesday. They say the development follows the recovery of hundreds of bodies, quote, buried deep in the ground and covered with waste over the weekend at Nasser Hospital in Khan Yunis, central Gaza, and at Al-Shifa Hospital in Gaza City in the north. A total of 283 bodies were recovered at Nasser Hospital, of which 42 were identified. Okay, just as a reminder, this is what Israel did to Al-Shifa Hospital. It was previously the largest, even semi-functional hospital remaining inside of Gaza. Think about the thousands and thousands of innocent men, women, children who were reliant on this hospital, not just to get bare minimum care that the nurses and doctors could provide to them because of the restrictions on medical supplies getting into Gaza, but also people who were trying to use this as a place of refuge. This is what has been done to Al-Shifa Hospital. So they continue down here. They say, among the deceased were allegedly older people, women, and wounded, while others were found tied with their hands, tied and stripped of their clothes, okay? Stripped of their clothes and bound with their hands tied, okay? Now, I've seen other comments from other outlets like CNN and the New York Times, etc., that say it's possible that some of these bodies, okay, we have basically three different options here. In every single one of those options, the IDF is responsible for the deaths of these people. So we're talking about hundreds of people who have been found in these mass graves. There's three different options. Option number one is that these people were killed as a result of the IDF raids on these hospitals and the surrounding, the surrounding blocks around the hospitals. Remember, I showed you guys those pictures of what it looked like in the blocks surrounding Al-Shifa. Those blocks were also flattened to the ground. So it could be option number one, that some of these people were killed during those raids and that the doctors, the nurses, the staff at the hospital had no other option but to temporarily bury them outside the hospital complex. Option number two is that we had other reports that were coming out at the time of potential summary executions by the IDF within the hospital compounds. And it's also possible that, the IDF themselves killed some of these people and then just dumped them in a mass grave. The option number three is that some of the families of the people who had been killed by the IDF temporarily buried their family members in the surrounding region, and then, and this is also part of this report, later on, the IDF may have gone and dug up some of these bodies in order to do, I guess, DNA tests to figure out if some of them may have been hostages who had been killed, Israeli hostages who had been killed. And then after they did these DNA tests, they just sort of dumped all the bodies in a mass grave. So again, regardless of necessarily who put the bodies where and at what time and in what order, the IDF is responsible for these people being killed. The IDF is responsible for these mass graves, okay, entirely. Now, we continue with more information on Al-Shifa. They say, citing the local health authorities in Gaza, Miss Shamdasani added that more bodies had been found at Al-Shifa Hospital. Quote, reports suggested that there were 30 Palestinian bodies buried in two graves in the courtyard of Al-Shifa Hospital in Gaza City, one in front of the emergency building and the others in front of the dialysis building. Again, there are reports that the hands of some of these bodies were also tied, okay? And she also added that there could be many more victims that have yet to be uncovered. So listen, guys, if you find people in a mass grave who are stripped naked and have their hands tied behind their back, how are you supposed to interpret that? Are we supposed to continue believing, as Israel and the United States and most of the media wants us to, that this is a war of self-defense? That this is a targeted war against Hamas? Even if some of the people who were found in these mass graves were Hamas militants? even in a situation of war, when you are at war, it is a war crime to capture an enemy combatant and then disarm them and strip them down, tie their hands behind their backs, and then execute them or throw them in a mass grave. Even if they were all Hamas militants, these kinds of actions would still be categorized as war crimes, but we have no indication that the people who are in these mass graves even are militants. In all likelihood, a huge bulk of them are just civilians. Okay? Now, they continue here. 200 Days of Horror, quote, "The intentional killing of civilians, detainees, and others who are hors de combat is a war crime." Exactly what I just said. Hors de combat just means they're not participating in active militant activities, right? And they say as of the 22nd of April, just a couple days ago, more than 34,000 Palestinians have been killed in Gaza, including almost 15,000 children now and almost 10,000 women, according to the High Commissioner's office, citing the enclave's health authorities. Another 77,000 have been injured, and over 7,000 are assumed to be under the rubble. Every 10 minutes, a child is killed or wounded in Gaza. Every 10 minutes. Now, as they point out here, they say, according to the local authorities, 7,000 are assumed to be under the rubble. So that number could be higher. And if they're under the rubble, unfortunately, that means there's a high degree of likelihood that they are probably also dead. So really, this 34,000 number is probably closer to around over 40,000 at this point. And even that may still be an undercount. Because if you think about the process that the Gaza Health Ministry has for trying to count the amount of people who have been killed, if the IDF has completely disabled their hospital system, has killed hospital workers, has killed doctors and nurses and civilian workers in Gaza, then how are you supposed to continue getting updated, accurate, reliable counts? So if anything, again, I think these numbers are probably drastic undercounts from what the true reality of all of this is. Now, again, as I've talked about before, we've also had massive IDF-backed, ISF-backed, Israeli security forces-backed settler pogroms in the West Bank over the last couple of weeks. And so I've talked about a lot of this. I won't rehash it. But I mean, I think it's important to point out here that the United Nations is saying that settler violence has been organized with the support, protection, and participation of the Israeli security forces. So it's not some rogue settlers committing crimes. This is part of the Israeli project of ethnically cleansing the West Bank. Okay? That is what this is. We have seen a record number of settlement, it be approved by the Israeli government into Palestinian territory in the West Bank. So this is part of that ongoing project, right? The United Nations is acknowledging it here. And, of course, we're going to have the United States, the Biden administration, his spokespeople, his lackeys, coming out and trying to spin it in the best light that they possibly can. So let's go ahead and watch yet another one of these State Department clips of this guy. I think his last name is Patel. I'm blanking on his name. And he's going to answer a question about what exactly is Biden doing to address the issue of the mass graves that were just uncovered.
Back. Go ahead.
I did. Thanks for that. I just wanted to circle back to what one of our colleagues asked, which was in relation to the mass graves story. My colleague referred to calls for an independent investigation, and you said that you were asking for more information from the government of Israel, and that is squarely where we're leaving the conversation. Why is there resistance to support an independent investigation into how 300 people ended up in a mass grave?
It's not about resistance to this particular situation. It is me not wanting to speak in detail about something which Saeed posed as a hypothetical question, when from the United States perspective, I don't have any additional information on this, aside from the public reporting that Humaira and Saeed and others have asked about, which is a fair question. But what I'm saying from the United States perspective is that we've seen those reports, and we are asking the government of Israel for more details and more information.
And do you believe that the government of Israel is a credible source in enlightening you on that?
We do.
So there you go. We're going to have Israel, once again, investigate themselves, investigate their own potential war crimes, right? I mean, what do you say at this point? What do you say at this point? Are we expected to eat up this bullshit that he's serving us on a silver platter? I mean, I believe this is a former State Department lawyer, right? This guy, Brian. And even he isn't buying this shit. Somehow, I don't think the State Department would defer to Russia as a credible source to investigate itself if a mass grave were discovered in Ukrainian territory that the Russians had occupied. Yeah, exactly. I mean, this doesn't apply to anybody else. Israel gets an exception when it comes to any of these issues of international law or human rights or anything like that. They get the exception, right? Which is also incredibly ironic, because whenever you bring up the idea of imposing sanctions on Israel or even conditioning aid to Israel, one of the most frequent responses you'll get from Israel defenders is, well, why are you trying to single out Israel? There are tons of human rights abuses and war crimes going on around the world at any given time. Why are you trying to hyper-focus on Israel? And the reality of the situation is the exact opposite of that. The United States has a carve-out for Israel. Israel gets put up on a pedestal that no other country does, okay, when it comes to issues of international law. They get a blank check. We leave them to do the investigations into themselves. And I'll circle back around to reporting that maybe Biden is reconsidering the half-assed, singular sanctions that I talked about a couple days ago against a specific IDF battalion. But I mean, it's just fucking embarrassing at this point. I don't know how guys like this even sleep at night. You are being asked a question about a mass grave with 300 people that were found outside of a hospital in Gaza, and your response is, we're going to let the people who created that mass grave investigate themselves. I mean, what the fuck are we doing? Again, would this be the U.S. response if Russia had done this in Ukraine? Would we say, oh, well, we're just going to have Putin investigate it, and we're waiting on more information from him? Of course not. They don't even want an independent investigation. What does that say about all this? That on none of these different crimes is the United States willing to pressure Israel to even allow for an independent investigation. I think it says a lot. Now, in the meantime, we also have Israel ramping up some of their strikes across Gaza. And I think it's important to note here, ordering new evacuations in the north. Now, you'll also notice down here, airstrikes, tank shelling in the north, central, and South Gaza. So we're doing the same shit again, right? Oh, we need you to flee from this part of the north and go to central Gaza. Okay, now we need you to go from central Gaza to southern Gaza. Okay, whoops, now we're also going to ramp up our invasion of Rafah. Right? There's never been a safe place inside of Gaza. This idea that, oh, isn't Israel so moral by warning civilians to get out of the way? They have been bombing the places they've been telling civilians to go this entire time. Oh, we're ordering new evacuations in the north. And also, by the way, we're using tanks and we're using airstrikes in central and South Gaza. And we're also doing this. Israel says it is poised to move on Rafa. So this is probably the ground invasion of Rafa. It seems like it's going to happen probably in the coming days, okay? Or maybe weeks, but I think based on what I've read, probably in the coming days. They seem to be saying that this is imminent, okay? And you think about all of the death, all of the destruction so far, the invasion of Rafa, where half the population of Gaza has been stuffed into in sort of like a massive makeshift refugee camp. This is going to be severely more catastrophic than anything we've seen so far. And this is what the U.S. is giving a green light to, right? Keep in mind that reporting we've talked about over the last couple of days, that apparently behind the scenes, Biden gave a green light for Israel to do this Rafah invasion in exchange for Israel not starting World War III with Iran, okay? Now, just as a reminder, I covered this a couple of days ago, this is kind of what I think the Rafah invasion is going to overwhelmingly look like. This was one of their recent strikes in Rafah. Kills 22, mostly children, as the U.S. advances an aid package. So 18 children were killed in this one strike. I believe it was all from the same family. 18 out of 22 that were killed in this strike were children. Now, what were the other 4? Probably also civilians, right? And this is happening at the same time as the United States is, of course, giving them $26 billion. $26 billion. Now, while all of this is also happening, you also have the IDF, or the Israeli security forces, ramping up their military activities in the West Bank as well. So here from, I believe this is the Wall Street Journal, Israel's hunt for one elusive militant brings Gaza tactics to the West Bank. So the top part of this, go read it if you want to. They're focusing on how the IDF was trying to chase down this one specific guy that they were looking for. But I think that a couple paragraphs here in this article are really noteworthy. They say here, Israel is deploying wartime tactics against militants in some of the 19 refugee camps that still dot the West Bank over 75 years after Israel's founding, displaced more than 700,000 Palestinians in what Palestinians refer to as the Nakba. The camps are now dense urban environments marked by poverty and longing by residents to return to family homes in what is now Israel. Recent events have highlighted how quickly the territory can descend into chaos. Settler attacks on Palestinians erupted earlier this month after a teenage Jewish Israeli boy went missing and was later found dead in the West Bank. And in return, settlers attacked more than 17 villages, shooting weapons, burning cars and homes, and killing at least 5 Palestinians, according to rights groups and Palestinian officials. Over the weekend, Israeli troops killed at least 14 Palestinians during a West Bank raid. The military, of course, says that they were all combatants. Are we going to trust them at face value? I think you guys know what I would say to that. The military conducted about 40 drone strikes in the West Bank from October to March, the official said. In the roughly 20 years before October 7th, there had only been a handful of such strikes. So you understand that they're ramping up what they've been doing in Gaza now in the West Bank. 40 drone strikes in the West Bank since October 7th. They say Israeli forces have killed more than 435 Palestinians in the West Bank and East Jerusalem since October 7th, according to the UN, and about 4,900 Palestinians in the West Bank have been injured since then, either by Israeli forces or settlers, according to the United Nations. And this also comes on top of the fact that, as I've told you guys before, even before October 7th, in the West Bank, it was one of the deadliest years on record, okay, before October 7th. So when you hear people come out and say, well, Hamas violated the ceasefire, right? On October 6th, there was a ceasefire, Hamas violated that, and so of course, Israel has to go and massacre a bunch of Palestinians as sort of a revenge tour, right? Keep that in mind, because there was never a real ceasefire unless you believe that an ongoing apartheid, a violent ethnic cleansing, settler terrorism, that all of that is somehow peaceful. All of that is not a violation of a ceasefire, which I think is obviously absurd at face value. Now, finishing off with a couple of these things, we have reporting here from the Jerusalem Post that the U.S. is not going to be imposing those sanctions on that IDF battalion, the Netza Yehuda battalion, according to this report. Following pressure from all sides of the Israeli political spectrum, the U.S. has decided not to impose sanctions on this battalion. And so, I mean, listen, I don't know if this is confirmed as of this point. This is the main outlet that I saw covering this. So, take this with a grain of salt. This could be true. This could end up not being true, and maybe the sanctions do go through. Either way, the main reason I bring this up is because the sanctions in and of themselves were pointless from the beginning. I outlined this in one of my previous videos. They're basically unenforceable. The U.S. does not have a real mechanism to delineate where the billions of dollars in weapons we're giving to Israel are ending up in the hands of. To pick out one IDF battalion and say, you guys can't have the weapons, but we're going to give billions of dollars to the IDF in general, and we're not really going to do anything if Israel refuses to abide by our sanctions, then it's meaningless, right? And on top of that, it's like the irony of using the Leahy law to impose these sanctions. These sanctions were not imposed because of anything that has been done in Gaza since October 7th or in the West Bank since October 7th. These sanctions were imposed because this specific battalion was, revealed to be committing egregious human rights violations and crimes against Palestinians. And so the U.S. decides to basically do a little virtue signal and impose sanctions just specifically on them. So none of the conduct of what's happened in Gaza over the last 6 months in this genocidal war that Israel has been waging, none of that apparently violates the Leahy law. I mean, think about how absurd that is. The law is very clear. The United States is not legally allowed to sell weapons or give weapons to any military that has been credibly accused of human rights violations or war crimes. Not only has Israel been credibly accused of that, they've verifiably committed brazen war crimes countless times over the last 6 months. And even, besides just the war crimes that we've talked about on this channel, it's an admission that the Leahy law can be implemented against Israel, but then simultaneously saying, but we're not going to implement it against the entirety of the IDF. Just this one battalion. I mean, it's so fucking pathetic at this point, guys. And I'll finish off with this. Al Jazeera did some satellite imaging over Gaza. And once again, not the first time we've seen this happen, but once again, allegations, usually made by Israel, turn into confessions, right? And so here we have satellite imaging confirming that Israeli occupation forces are using Gaza hospitals as a military base. I mean, remember that other story that I covered of Israeli forces in the West Bank dressing up as civilians and going and raiding a hospital to kill what they said were militants, and then just executed those people in their hospital beds. I mean, think about that. That's the type of outrageous situation that you would expect Israel to accuse Hamas of having done. And they just did that. They dressed up as civilians and raided a hospital with a bunch of machine guns and then executed people in their hospital beds. And now, again, reportedly, using a hospital as a station for their military hardware. So, I mean, there you go. There are some of the updates over the last couple of days that we've gotten. I'm sure there's going to be more. It seems like every day, honestly, I don't like covering this stuff every day. It's horrible. It's terrifying. It's just endless destruction that it feels like we can almost do nothing about. And so I don't enjoy covering this stuff, but it's every single day that we get one more atrocity, one more war crime, one more step up the escalation ladder. And so this is I think, genuinely defining moment in time. And so I think it's important to focus on it.
Politic guy has the best politic. Believe me, no one does it like him. Believe me. Everyone is saying